Well, good afternoon and welcome to our audience members across the country and around the world. I'm Kendra Kopelke, co-editor of Passenger, and I'm speaking to you from Baltimore, Maryland. On behalf of the Passenger staff, thank you all so much for joining us today for what promises to be a wonderful reading by Roy Cheng Tsung and his daughters, Lauren and Christine, in celebration of Roy's new memoir, Oxhorn Bend. Before we get started, a couple of Zoom notes. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat feature. If you click on it, a chat box will show up on the side of your screen. And please feel free to make comments or ask questions during the reading. After the reading, we'll have a few minutes for questions and conversation. If you're hearing about Passenger Press for the first time today, we hope you will be inspired by this book launch to get to know us. Our mission is to showcase the work of older writers and promote the imagination in the later chapters of one's life. During this pandemic, with so many older Americans suffering in prolonged isolation, we need to hear these voices more than ever. And we're grateful to Zoom and the University of Baltimore for providing a global space where we can come together virtually and share these special occasions with you. We at Passenger are especially happy to present to you not just Roy Tsung, the author of Oxhorn Bend, but his two daughters, who were the reason that Roy became an author in the first place. And now I'd like to introduce Roy's daughter, Lauren. Lauren?
Hello, I'm Lauren. I'm the youngest daughter of Roy, and thank you for making the time to honor my dad's book today. As you know, he recently released Oxhorn Bend. We're incredibly proud of his multi-decade journey as a writer. We've witnessed his storytelling journey and how he's meticulously preserved our family history. Even today, we can learn a lot of lessons about freedom from his journey during the Cultural Revolution at the height of the Cold War. And we intend on reading a couple of passages to give you a taste of his story. So with that, Dad, could you kick us off? Dad, you're on mute. Yeah.
Thank you, Lauren. Prologue, June 4th, 1989. It was calm in the San Francisco Bay Area, where we had finally settled down to a peaceful life. My mother was just getting ready to turn in when the horrifying news of the Tiananmen massacre came on the air. Thank God we're no longer in Beijing, she sighed. I nodded, but my chest tightened. The very thought of the brutal dictatorship brought back memories of our miraculous escape 15 years ago. I know you've been through a lot on account of Father's decision, my mother said, and I can appreciate your frustration. My father, Roy Cheng Tsung, had served the nationalist government as Chinese consul in New York City. In 1953, shortly after the communists took over mainland China, he moved us from New York City, where I was born, back to his hometown, Beijing. It was the height of the Cold War, and this turned out to be an irreversible decision that tormented me for years. It's not that I don't love him. I honestly respect his patriotism, I admitted to my mother. But look what he has put us through. And why in the world did he burn the bridges and make it almost impossible for me to return to the States? My mother shook her head. Your father was a brilliant man. Then someone must have influenced his final decision, I said. Ever since our escape from communist China in 1974, I had been retracing my father's footsteps, searching for answers. And now, Lauren will read from Oxhorn Bend.
Thanks, Dad. So, my grandfather was a diplomat in the service of the Chinese nationalist government, where Chinese communists took over mainland China in 1949. So, I'm going to read a passage we call Perilous Position. Our carefree life came to an abrupt end in 1949 when my father received a letter from his youngest brother, my seventh uncle, in Beijing. It had been mailed in care of their elder brother in Hong Kong so as to not arouse the suspicions of the nationalist circles. The communists had seized all of mainland China, and seventh uncle was working for the new government. The Chiang Kai-shek reactionary regime is overthrown, wrote seventh uncle. Our country is no longer in the hands of foreign imperialists. I'm convinced that uncle's message must have struck a chord with my father. He had chosen his words well and urged my father to return to the motherland. It was like a seed that germinated in my father's mind and eventually took root. My mother was not impressed. She always had good instincts and thought the letter smelled of propaganda. You and your brother had not spoken or written to each other for years, she pointed out. How odd that he suddenly writes to you now. How do you know the letter wasn't someone else's idea? When confronted with my mother's suspicions, my father's face fell. For days after that, he looked like a man searching for something. No more bedtime stories, and the blue kite that we had made together lay in my closet. He needed time to learn more about the new situation in his homeland, but he had to be careful not to attract the attention of Chinese nationalists. The ambassador had kept a tight lid on news about the war situation in mainland China, but the downfall of the tottering Chiang Kai-shek regime did not come as a surprise to my father. Soon after the letter from seventh uncle, my mother and I returned to New York City, and my father resigned from the Chinese Nationalist Consular Service. Then, a few years later, he moved us to his hometown, Beijing, at the height of the Cold War. He had high hopes for the new government and wanted more than anything to be useful to his country. It proved to be a perilous position. And so I'll introduce my sister, Christine.
Hi, I'm Christine. I'm the oldest daughter, and I'm going to read two passages. The first one is Buried Pass from Oxford and Ben. This scene takes place in San Francisco in 1952 to 1953, after my grandfather had resigned from the Chinese Nationalist Diplomatic Service. Buried Pass. The YMCA in San Francisco's Chinatown was where my father got to know a group of Chinese scientists and students who had been educated and trained in the United States and were trying to return to mainland China. Their meeting in the YMCA could not have happened at a worse time, as the United States was seized by the Second Red Scare that spread fear of communist and Soviet espionage. Senator Joe McCarthy was on a wild crusade to rid the US of communists and communist sympathizers. Finally, his reckless smear tactics led him to be censored by the US Senate in 1954. My father probably caught the attention of FBI agents who were tailing the Chinese scientists. In 1952, two FBI agents came to our apartment in New York City. One interviewed my mother, while the other took notes. They wanted to know why my father wanted to return to China, and they asked her about his acquaintances at the YMCA. I was about 12 years old, but the haunting images of the two stony-faced agents in gray suits, shiny black shoes, and dark neckties never left me. Now I'm going to read another passage called Idealism. My father had always thought the only reason my grandfather brought him to China was his idealism and patriotism. So here's a short paragraph from his first book, Beyond Lojo Bridge. Idealism. One day in 1954, we were strolling along an old dirt road outside Beijing City's Fujian Gate. Worn-out mules harnessed to run-down carts wobbled by. The landscape on either side of the road was made up of shabby houses, shops, and eating houses with equally raggedy-looking people, dressed in the same shades of gray and black. I know that China is poor and backward now, my father said, but China will rise to be a modern nation. It is a big country with enormous potential power. That's why we brought you here. We want you to be a part of China's future. So now my dad's going to read another passage.
Thank you, Christine. This passage is from Oxhorn Bend. By the 1960s, all of the idealism that led my father back to China had vanished. But it was a turning point in my life. Defining moment. It was called a cultural revolution, but had nothing at all to do with culture. It was actually a power struggle between Communist Party Chairman Mao Zedong and State President Liu Shaoqi. Although I did not catch on until later on in the game. Mao was outgunned at first, but he was a master at tearing down his opponents with false information and divisive tactics. To overthrow his arch enemy, Mao instigated a massive grassroots level campaign against Liu's capitalist rulers, who were purged from governing and administrative positions and disgraced. China was a totalitarian state ruled by Mao, a dictator who created mayhem to thwart his enemies. In August 1966, Mao personally unleashed delirious student Red Guards against his enemies, whom he called cows and demons. Mao was hailed as the great helmsman, and his words had become gospel. The adulation reached frenzied levels as young zealots were turned into perpetrators of heinous crimes, all in the name of revolution. In the summer of 1968, a pack of Red Guards stormed into our home. They were from the Foreign Trade Institute, my father's employer. A young male screamed, "Zhong Weixian, come out!" My father, face pale but unfazed, plodded out of the bedroom. "You're a spy for the American imperialists," yelled the leader of the pack, and held up a mock warrant. Two Red Guards seized my father's arms and whisked him off to the school campus and threw him into a small interrogation room. When my father refused to admit to espionage, they hauled him off to a struggle meeting that was tantamount to a kangaroo court. By the time he was finally released, his ankles were swollen beyond recognition, and he coughed out white foam. What did they do to you?" my mother cried. "Don't worry," my father forced a smile. When I asked him about his cracked spectacles, all I could get out of him was a comical description of his chief tormentor, whom he nicknamed Little Mustache, a midget with a small mustache that twitched like Charlie Chaplin's imitation of Adolf Hitler. "I was really hurt," my father said, when he banged his fist on the table and called me a dog spy. Somehow my father had managed to survive and return home. That night, my father started heaving and coughing up blood. "I have no regrets for myself," he started to say, panting for air. "It was my own choice to return to my homeland." I grabbed his hand, eyes welling. "But your mother doesn't deserve this, and you've lost your job on account of me. I'm truly sorry." Just before he passed out, my father gasped, "Take care of mother." On January 3rd, 1969, my father died in my arms on our way to the hospital. There was no funeral. His ashes were scattered somewhere north of Beijing. "Farewell," I whispered. My mother and I were just two tiny leaves lost in the land of chaos and terror. But it was a defining moment for me. I thought of the blue postage stamp bearing President Franklin D. Roosevelt's famous words, freedom of speech and religion from want and fear. It was my father's favorite, and I knew that my father would have wanted me to move on with the hope of freedom. I knew where to go, and there was no turning back. And now I'd like to show you some photographs. This is 1941. That's the year I was born. My father was vice consul, Chinese vice consul at the time. And my mother was wearing a qipao, that's a Chinese, typical Chinese dress. Next picture, please. And this is my mother again. She's about 70 years old. And with Christine and Lauren, that was about the time I started writing my book. Next picture. Now this is Lojo Bridge, the title of my first book. Lojo Bridge was the crossing point between British Hong Kong and Communist China. Of course, today, there's no such thing as British Hong Kong. It's just Hong Kong is part of China. And hence this bridge went away. People fly over directly from Hong Kong to Communist China. Here you see on the right side of the picture, two British Hong Kong officers wearing khaki uniforms. And on the other side, opposite side, are Chinese PLAs. That's People's Liberation Army soldiers guarding the bridge, their side of the bridge. And in the middle is a Chinese peasant girl who lives close to the border, and they could more or less freely go back and forth with a small, some kind of a document. But this is what the bridge, this is what the crossing looked like in 1953, probably throughout the 50s. And then it started to change. Next picture. And this is what Lojo Bridge looked like in 1974, the year that my mother and I escaped from Communist China. You can see way inside the bridge on the other end, you can see the shadow of profile of two men standing. They're holding rifles, actually. Those are the PLA men, Chinese army men. And the red flag you can see is on the other side. All right, so my mother and I, there's a door on the left side where the first army man is standing with a rifle. That's the custom office on the Chinese side. We passed through the customs and the border inspection. And my mother and I walked slowly to this side. I had to hold my mother to cross the railway tracks. And we finally saw the British flag, the Union Jack fluttering. And the gray building that you see on the right is their outpost, the British Hong Kong outpost. And their immigration office is in there. And that's where I got interrogated. And it is described in the first chapter of my new book, Oxhorn Bend. Well, that's the last of the pictures. I'm going to hand it over to Kendra for questions and answers.
Thank you. Thank you, Roy. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Lauren. It's really a special occasion to have the family here because, Roy told us when he first wrote Beyond Lojo Bridge that the reason he wrote at all was because he so wanted the two of you to know your history living in California. And hearing what you read today, Roy, just brings up that contrast of the life that you lived and how you got here. It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking for me to hear it. But thank you so much for telling us your story and the courage that it took, first of all, to leave China, and secondly, to then sit down and share this story with your daughters and with all of us. I know how much it shaped our experience as editors, learning about what you went through and all of the difficulty. So, so here we are. Here we are with Oxford Bend, is Roy's new book, and just for this is his first book, Beyond Lojo Bridge, which really describes his father taking the family to China, and then Roy and his mother's miraculous escape. And then Oxford Bend picks up with telling the story of escaping China, coming to Hong Kong, and then creating a life for himself in the United States. So it's really a story that all of us, I think, are thinking about, is where is our home, and what is our story. So you've always been a great inspiration to us, Roy, and we're really thrilled to have you here. I want to now take um, any questions. I'm looking at the chat to see if anyone has a question. Here's one question, Roy, from Mary Alice. How did your mother readjust to the U.S.?
Hi, that's a good question. My mother is a quiet person, and she's short and petite, but she's a woman of strength. And throughout my years in our years in mainland China and even in Hong Kong, that's where I had to start from scratch. She was my supporting pillar. And she adopted rather fast. I remember when we first crossed the bridge. Now I'm revealing some of my book now. When we first crossed the bridge into Hong Kong and left and went to the railway station, I told my mother not to say anything, and she said, "Why?" I said, "There are Chinese spies here," and she said, "Oh, that's absurd. Why didn't you just relax and enjoy what you see on the train?" So that was my mother.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, you're also working on a book now about your mother, right?
Yes, I'm overcoming my writer's block. Hopefully soon, then I'll go back to work.
Here's another question from Susan Allen. Do you feel sympathy for the young activists in Hong Kong who must now leave for the UK or face incarceration in China?
Yes, very much so. And in the prologue I just read, there were also young people like them who started the Tiananmen mass event. They were also yearning for freedom, yearning for democracy.
Do you ever want to go back and see China?
Many people have asked me that, and I always told them that when I grow old and become harmless, and if there's a regime change, I would love to go back. After all, I lived there for 20 years, and that is my father's hometown and my ancestral land. But time has passed. I am old and harmless, but the regime has not changed.
Mm. Yeah, I know when you were working on the book, I think you struggled sometimes with what to reveal and what not to reveal, and that's certainly the question of any memoirist. But in your situation, whether to use people's names or how to refer to people was always something on your mind, right?
Yes, exactly. There was one character in both books, my father's old bosom friend, his buddy. They studied together in elementary school. They went on to high school together, and they went on to college together. and I often called him Uncle Wei in the book. Now, Wei is not his real name.
Mhm. Here's another question. Please, what enduring truths or values would you want your daughters and your readers to hold dear?
Can you repeat that, please?
What enduring truths or values would you want your daughters and your readers to hold dear?
Well, this is on several levels. I hold value to truth. Always believe in the truth. Then in my last reading, I read The Four Freedoms, President Franklin Roosevelt. Actually, it was a postage stamp I had in my stamp collection. The stamp collection went up in flames. Most of it went up in flames. And my father, this is during the bad moment, he asked me, "Do you still have that stamp?" And I found it. And he said, when you were young in the States, you knew about freedom, but you didn't know, it was a difficult concept for you to really understand it. But today you understand. And I really understood the meaning of freedom from fear.
Mm. Mm. This is a similar question. What do you want the younger generation to know about your story? Why do you want them to know?
Well, I wrote this for a younger generation, and I expressed the four freedoms in there. And my father, why he, my second book is actually a journey in itself, writing it, and also discovery. It's like taking a train into the past. And as I got off at each station, it was like enlightenment, okay, on the way. The truth I wanted to find out was, why did my father bring us to China? Was it only because of patriotism? Was there any other reason? Why did he prevent me from getting back my citizenship? In the first book and the second book, you'll read that my father, he asked my mother to decline any offers by U.S. immigration to get me a U.S. passport. And why did he do that? This was a journey that I had to go through. And I hope that the readers will also go through a journey of into the past and what was like then and what is today, to you appreciate today even more.
Did you ever ask your father why he brought you to China once you got there and the situation was so difficult for your family?
You know, I didn't ask him point blanketly. I always thought that it was patriotism. And Christine read that chapter, what went on when we had a little walk outside. My father, as my mother said, my father was actually had a lot of foresight. He had foresight that China would become strong, even though when he and I took that walk, there were only mule carts, shabby houses, even the place we lived, the little alley. It's hard to believe that one could see Beijing as it is today.
Mm-hmm.
And so I never asked him, but I always thought that it was his idealism and his patriotism that brought us there. At that time, I didn't think of idealism. It was when I grew up to become more matured, and I realized that he was an idealist as well.
That's interesting. Here's another question. How do you compare the isolation these days in the pandemic and the political isolation back then?
That is such a good question. None
That's-
of them are good. I can't compare. They're both horrible and scary. One is pandemic, and you don't know if you're going to be the next one. And the other during the Cultural Revolution, you never know if a Red Guard would storm into our house and go from there. So you get the idea. It's like you're waiting to be the victim. It's really horrible. But the difference is, well, the similarity is that you have no control. We have no control over the virus. And you have no control of the communist leadership, Mao Zedong especially. Although the big difference is that I'm now living in a democratic society. And this is still a young country. It's only 300 years old. What we experience today is only temporary. When the current generation, I mean the kids, when they grow up, they will see today as a little blurb in the history.
Well, someone asked if any chance we could get a photo of the mailbox that you used to hang on to when being buffeted by the New York winds before you left for China.
You must have read my book, all of it. I went to New York City in 1975, and I did take a picture of that mailbox. I don't know who you are, but I'd be happy to send it to you. Also, when writing this book, the second book, I went online. I love Google Map. I love to Google and Google Map. And Google Map has this satellite photo capability. And you'll read about it. You'll read about it in Oxford Bend. But I zoomed in to that street, and I found the mailbox, but it moved to the corner. It's still there, but it's in a different spot. And I zoomed to the original spot, and I could see the original. There were some traces of a screw or something left. It was fun. Part of writing is fun because you're going on a train ride to the past, and you mostly enjoy what you see, right?
Yeah. Did you use pictures too? A lot of pictures to stir your memory?
Yes, indeed. The photos I shared with you just now, and there are other pictures. We lost all our pictures in most of our pictures. My relatives kept pictures of us. My aunt in Hong Kong, and I have another aunt. I have many aunts. One's in New York. They all kept pictures of us. My mother's wedding picture they had, so they returned to us. And I also found lots of pictures of Lojo Bridge, and that was just one of the scenes that I took for this launch.
Roy, here's a question. Someone wants to know if anyone in your family had bounded feet.
My grandmother on my mother's side. My grandmother, I did meet her. It's in my to-be new book. But I went to my mother's hometown in southern China. She was born and raised in a tiny island. It was only 2 miles radius, diameter. Everybody knew each other there. And it's called Drum Wave Island, Gulangyu. And that's where I met my grandmother. She had bound feet.
Well, here is, do you see any similarities between former President Trump and Mao's use of fear and misinformation to fuel his political campaign?
My father often told me, and it's in the book too, he said, study the lessons of history.
Mhm.
Not only China, but also Germany went through this too.
Mhm. Yeah. Any advice for future writers who need extra encouragement to take that journey to the past? Any key lessons learned?
You know, you have to want to do it.
Mm,
That's number one. When I wrote my first book, when it came to the part of the Cultural Revolution and the scene of my father, I had to put my pen down. It was not until months later. In fact, it wasn't until I started in 1978 and to start writing. Of course, I was a novice then. And then when it came to the Cultural Revolution, I stopped writing. And it wasn't until in the 90s when Christine and Lauren, you saw the picture, that I was determined.
mm,
I decided I must finish this book. It's
Mm.
for them. It's
Mm.
not for myself.
Wow. Wow. I want to ask maybe one more question.
Mhm.
Did your father consider going to Taiwan, where the nationalist government had fled when the communists took over, rather than going to mainland China?
I think my mother would have answered that question on my behalf if she were here. So definitely no. Um, in my second book, there is a scene where my father had already resigned from the National Foreign Service. And so he was out without a job, came to New York City to join us. He had to look for something. And so, but he had no skills apart from being a translator, and he had studied Columbia University. He had studied international law, but he couldn't fix a car. He couldn't ring a cash register. He had none of those skills. So what could he do? And so my granduncle on my mother's side, he was an author. He said, "Oh, do you know there is a job in the United Nations? You can translate for the Chinese representative there." At that time, mainland China was not in the United Nations; it was Taiwan. And my father said, "They don't even represent China. Why would I translate for them?"
Mm.
And so he went to the West Coast and found some jobs that eventually got him into trouble.
Yeah.
Read about it.
Yeah, he was never trusted, right? He was always under suspicion.
The part that they were especially suspicious of was when he was in the United States. The communists knew everything about him when he was in the nationalist government. There was records of everything that went on there. He never joined any party. He never joined the communists or the nationalists. He was nonpartisan, and they knew that.
Mm. Well, there's so much to talk about, Roy. I have to say that hearing again that you started working on this in what
78.
1978, and now it's 2020, and we're publishing your second book and you're writing your third. It just makes me think about your determination, but how, people want writing to go quickly. They want things to happen very quickly, and they want to have answers quickly now. And look at the way that you just spent your life raising this very difficult question.
May I say one thing, please?
Yeah.
A comment. I'm not a writer. Words do not come out for me easily. I'm sure we are joined here by poets and writers from Passenger Books. Words will come out easily for them, but not for me. And that's why it took me so many years.
Well, we love that you stuck with it, and we love how long it took you so that you're here today to really share this with us. It's a remarkable story, and I hope people that are listening and watching can see all the elements that are spinning around in this story of one family that wants to live their life. Very profound. I think we should probably wrap up now. But I will just say from Passenger, the book is on sale. The book Oxford and Bend is on sale on our website, as well as Beyond Lojo Bridge, the story of Roy's escape with his mother. And we know that you can also buy it on Amazon. It's an easy option for people. But if you do have a choice of Passenger or Amazon, we can just tell you that all the money that you spend on Passenger goes to Passenger rather than Amazon. So we would appreciate it if you would give us a try. I really want to thank Lauren and Christine. I mean, knowing the two of you would be part of the story was just, to me and to also us at Passenger, a kind of a dream come true. Like, here's the first audience and here's the inspiration for this book. And just to meet you and get to know you has been absolutely wonderful, remarkable. You must be so proud of your father and today. Roy, again, thank you for being part of Passenger. And finally, for everyone here, if you believe in this mission of Passenger to elevate the voices of older writers, we hope you'll go to our website, look at the kinds of things we do. We have a journal, we publish books, we have a podcast, we have a pandemic diary. And while you're there, you could sign up for our weekly emails and we could be more in touch. It's a small independent press and it has a personal touch. We keep it personal. So this has been a marvelous reading. The link for Passenger is probably up on the chat. I don't see it, but maybe it is there. I want to thank the Tsung family, and I want to thank Jared Schuster, who's behind the scenes running this webinar from the University of Baltimore. Thank you so much. And of course, everyone at Passenger, Mary Azrael, Christine Drawl, Panta Tofanji, Roseanne Singer, and John Shore. We hope to see you all again soon. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.